Saturday, November 7th talk about mind in U.S. history. We have for you today a wonderful speaker. I say this with complete bias because he is my husband, but it's still true. And he is going to, well, I'm going to let him tell you what he's going to do. I'm just going to tell you about him. Kurt was a lawyer in San Francisco, a managing partner of a large law firm, a litigator for 40 years. He retired and began a second career as a college teacher. He taught for 10 years. He taught undergraduate courses in constitutional and other kinds of law, like environmental law at St. Mary's College to undergraduates, and then graduated to teaching at lifelong learning centers, both here at OLLI in Berkeley and at the Fromm Institute in San Francisco. That was his third career. His fourth career was as a co-director here at Dharma College with me for 3 years. The first 3 years we were here, and a teacher also on the faculty. So he is now retired from 4 different careers, and we don't know what's coming next, but we know it will be wonderful. So without further ado, I introduce you to Kurt, and I will say only that afterwards, after he speaks, he'll ask for questions, and there'll be time for questions and answers. And also, we're going to have a little bit light refreshments in the lobby and an opportunity to gather and talk and ask him further questions at that time as well. So we hope you'll join us for a few minutes after the talk in the lobby. And you have the material about what's coming up next here at Dharma College. So of course, we hope to see you again here soon. So Kurt?
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. Welcome. It's nice of all of you to come out and listen to an old retired lawyer talk about a very old 228-year-old document called the Constitution of the United States of America. Just a brief word with respect to personal safety. There are a number of wires up here in the front of the room, and afterwards you should wander up here. Please watch your step, because it's a little bit hazardous as a result of all these recording devices. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about an event, this Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, which was not only an event of great importance in our country's history, but really in the history of the whole world, because the document that they finally came to agreement on after 5 months of exhausting dialogue has not only survived, but it has enabled the country to fulfill what the most far-seeing of the people who participated in the convention had in mind, which was to have a stable framework of government that would enable the country to grow and flourish as it has. And even countries that don't like us very much these days admire the stability and longevity of this document. So our little inquiry this afternoon is really to talk about how and why this document came about. And I always like to focus on the human side of these kinds of events, because I don't think enough of us probably appreciate enough what an accomplishment this was, that people who came together with hugely different points of view on dozens and dozens and dozens of items for debate could end up reaching an agreement, and could do it under physical conditions which were really quite negative. And that's why I refer in the title to the long, hot summer in Philadelphia. Now, we call this Mind in History, and that requires us to take a bit of a preliminary look. Most of you know that the current curriculum at Dartmouth College is based on this book, Revelations of Mind, authored by Tartang Toku, who was the founder of Dartmouth College and the leader of the Nyingma Tibetan Buddhist community. And there are a number of insights in this book which asks us to look at the operations of our mind as a step in taking control of our lives and our current experiences. And it's a very sophisticated work, as those of you who have read it or taken courses based on it know. And I can't possibly do it justice in giving you a few bullet points here at the start, but there is a linkage between the insights of the author of this book and what happened in Philadelphia 228 years ago. So here are a few quick summaries of some of these insights. Throughout our lives, our minds are called upon to process all of our experience, which comes to us through our senses, the sensory data. And as the author points out, and as we can know from our own experience, the work of the mind in processing those experiences doesn't end with the experience. Somehow, it's cataloged, it's filed away in an enormous, almost infinite archive of our experiences. And so that the result of that is, by the stages of life that we are now at, we've got an accumulation of past experiences, the labeling, naming of those experiences, whether it's people that we've known or events that we've witnessed, whatever it is, and it's all there. And the insight that the author points out is that a lot of that is stale. A lot of it is based on very, very distant past experience. And there's a buildup of that in all of us. Sometimes we're aware of it, and sometimes we're not. So one of the results of that is that what we think of as our current, new, contemporary experience is really, in large part, a recycling by our mind of that past activity, or judgment, or bias, or feeling, or emotion, or whatever it was. So, if in your grammar school, the class bully was a redhead with freckles, and you may not even be aware of the impact of that experience, but that person made you anxious, fearful, whatever. It's a negative association that may be buried deep in these archives. Today, many decades later, if you encounter someone with red hair and freckles, there is possibly, without you realizing it, an influence on your reaction to that person as a result of this recycled, long-buried negative association. I've told the story in classes that I've taught of this phenomenon working in my life at one time when I was quite aware of it. It wasn't buried, it wasn't in the subconscious. I went to a high school reunion. I hadn't seen, it was a 50th reunion, and there was a woman that I ran into there who I hadn't seen for probably 48 of that intervening 50 years. And I had this tremendously positive and happy memory of her wedding day, which was one of the most beautiful ceremonies and receptions and so forth that I had ever attended. Made a deep impression on me. And that's where I wanted to start the conversation. And I did. and it turned out to be a very insensitive thing, because it was a very dated and stale perception of an event that actually was a precursor to a very unhappy life for this woman. And the marriage was a disaster, and it was succeeded by a couple of other domestic disasters. And so I became acutely aware of this phenomenon of how we can, in the name of doing something new and current and fresh, actually be deeply influenced by the past and what is being recycled from the past. So one of the conclusions that the author draws from this is that if we passively accept and identify with everything that our mind presents to us from this file system or archive, we may never really grow. We may never truly evolve and have a rich experience of the present, because we're kind of stuck in the past. And a corollary of that brings us to something that's very important in the understanding of this convention in Philadelphia so long ago. The author talks about a phenomenon he calls positioning, how we remain very, very stubbornly bonded to a point of view, a position, a principle. And we do that sometimes even when our logical minds are telling us we're wrong. But out of kind of a combination of stubbornness and an emotional attachment to the past point of view, we remain bonded to that position, and it becomes an impediment, especially in a group setting where the objective is to try to reach consensus. And a fair reading of history about the attitudes that the people who came to Philadelphia to work on this project called the United States Constitution is that very, very many of them at the start in May of 1787 were very, very rigidly attached to their prior points of view. And we're going to see examples of that as we go along. So, here is what I call the wax museum kind of portrayal of the convention. This all looks very staged and courtly. It's a painting, obviously, and I'm afraid this kind of art lulls us into a feeling, an artificial really feeling about what this event was like. Because this painting depicts the conclusion of the 5 months of horrendous wrangling and debating and exhausting dialogue among the people who were sent from their various states to Philadelphia to work on a new framework of government. And it somewhat masks the struggle because it's so idealized. And you see at the head of things on the platform there, George Washington, who did preside over the entire 5 months of the convention. We know from his writings and diary entries that he was so fatalistic during these debates that it was going to be impossible to ever bring this group into a feeling of consensus and unanimity on anything, much less an entire new blueprint of government. And he recorded this several times. And it really is appropriate that it's been called the miracle in Philadelphia, that consensus and agreement eventually came about. So we say 5 months. It began in early May of 1787 and concluded in September. And it's worth pausing here at the start to ask why they were all sent to Philadelphia and why a new form of government was necessary. So the 13 colonies, as they were first called, became states officially on July 4th of 1776, 11 years earlier than this gathering in Philadelphia. And there's an irony in the fact that they called it the Declaration of Independence, because obviously it was meant to express independence from the King of England and the Parliament of England and the oppression of the colonies that had become identified with the relationship between the New World and England. But truly, the 13 colonies which became states on that day had strong feelings of independence from one another. And there are very surprising ways that history records this kind of independence or rivalry played itself out. New Jersey considered New York a foreign country. And in fact, still probably does. And so New Jersey established its own customs service to regulate navigation across the Hudson River. 9 of the 13 states had their own navy at this time. And you know, it was only the pressure of having to cooperate with one another in order to fight the common enemy during the Revolutionary War that, you know, forced a kind of uncomfortable alliance among these 13 states. So that led to the earliest forms of what might be thought of as a national government, as opposed to 13 completely separate and independent state governments. So there was a Continental Congress formed in 1774. It went through 3 iterations. It eventually adopted what everyone turned out to agree was a very weak form of central government under the Articles of Confederation. It's interesting, that government, that national government, which preceded the one that was agreed to in Philadelphia, had a single branch, just a legislature. It was called the Continental Congress. It had only one house, or legislative chamber, not 2, and each state had 1 vote. So the small states and the large states had an equal voice. But there was no executive branch, no president. There was no judicial branch, no Supreme Court. And worst of all, in terms of being effective, that Congress had no power to impose and collect taxes from the states. So we come to the end of the Revolutionary War with an enormous debt that has to be paid off. And because of the weakness of the Articles of Confederation and the lack of power in the Congress, there's no way to compel the states to pay off the debt. So the most that the Congress could do was to pass a formula that said each of the states, this is their share. But it was simply a recommendation. They had no power to impose the tax or to collect the tax. And so, as it turned out, some states paid it and others didn't. And that wasn't too beneficial. So that is an internal reason that a new form of government was necessary. But there was also an external reason, and that is the issue of how we looked to the other countries in the world, particularly the countries in Western Europe, after the war. John Adams from Massachusetts was in England on a diplomatic assignment after the war. And he was told by people who were high in the British government at that time, that His Majesty's government didn't view the United States as united at all. These jealousies and rivalries were still very, very obvious. And Adams was told that the British government would negotiate separately with all 13 states in matters of trade and other, items of international agreement. That's how divided we were in pressing foreign countries. And that, of course, made us vulnerable. We had land, we had abundant natural resources, and the external reason for having a stronger central government was obviously a defensive one. We shouldn't be a temptation for an invasion, a re-invasion by England, or one by France, or some other powerful country interested in our territory and resources. So there were, fortunately, people, leaders in various states, like Alexander Hamilton in New York, and James Madison from Virginia. These are familiar names in terms of the so-called founding fathers. And they persuaded the Continental Congress in February of 1787 to call a convention of the 13 states in Philadelphia to start 3 months later in May. So it's quite interesting. Rhode Island, little Rhode Island, refused to participate. They wouldn't send any delegates. But the other 13 states did, as other 12 states did, and they selected, through their legislatures, a total of 74 delegates in total to attend. Now, the truth is that not all of them attended, even though they were authorized to represent their states. Only 55 of the 74 actually ever showed up in Philadelphia, and they didn't all show up at the same time. Some of them came and went, and some put in cameo appearances and didn't really stay the course. So, on an average day of this 5 month of intense debate, only about 30 people actually showed up and took part in these debates. That's about the number of people in this room right now. They were the ones who carried the burden of thrashing through all of the issues. Here's a picture, a fairly recent picture, of the chamber where they met. It's Independence Hall in Philadelphia. It's where the Declaration of Independence had been signed 11 years earlier. And why Philadelphia? Well, at that time, Philadelphia was considered the leading city in the United States. It had a population of about 45,000. New York at that time was 33,000. And so it was deemed to be the right place to hold this rather momentous meeting. The delegates, as you can see, would sit 3 or 4 to a table. There was a presiding officer, George Washington, who was an elected delegate from the state of Virginia. There was a recording secretary who wasn't really a very good recording secretary, took very minimal notes, as it turned out. But fortunately, for the sake of history, several of the people who were present took very, very detailed notes, and James Madison from Virginia is the one who took the most. And he's been relied on by subsequent historians for a lot of the details of what went on. Interestingly, the group of delegates chosen by their state legislatures was pretty young in the demographic sense. The average age of all the delegates was just 43 years of age. At that time, Alexander Hamilton was only 32 years old, and Madison, James Madison, was 36. The first two speakers who addressed the convention, the first was the governor of Virginia. He was 33, and he was followed to the podium by a delegate from South Carolina who was only 29. So by far the elder statesman of this group was Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania and a resident of Philadelphia at that time. He was 81. Now, again, it's just sort of looking at the personnel, a lot of people mistakenly think that John Adams from Massachusetts, whom I mentioned earlier, and Thomas Jefferson from Virginia were among the so-called framers of the Constitution present at this convention. They were not. They weren't there for a single day because they were on diplomatic assignments in England and France, respectively. So they were not present.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Who were the two that were not present?
John Adams from Massachusetts and Thomas Jefferson from Virginia. And by the way, we will have time for questions afterwards, so we're not going to shut it off if you have any enduring inquiries about this event. So I like to think about this meeting, this series of meetings, as you know, a set of challenges to the writing of a new blueprint of government that were both philosophical, as we're going to see, and physical. And I want to start with the physical because by all accounts, the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, was an absolutely miserable time. The heat, the humidity, and the insects were written about, not just by the delegates themselves, but by journalists and others who wrote contemporaneous accounts. The delegates themselves were in this room, and because the insect problem outside was so bad, swarms of flies all over the place, they had to keep the windows shut tightly. And of course, that robbed them of any ventilation. You saw the painting. You know how heavy those woolen outfits were that they were in. Nobody was in Bermuda shorts or Birkenstocks or anything as comfortable as that. The nighttime was no more of a relief because the insect problem included bed bugs. And the sleeping quarters that were, the various boarding houses where the delegates from all the other states had to stay had the same problem. They had to keep the windows shut, so there was no ventilation at night either. By all accounts, the most uncomfortable delegate of all was Benjamin Franklin himself. At the age of 81, he had a horrible case of the gout throughout the summer of 1787. And he was very interested in attending all the sessions, but the jostling of his body, if he were to take a horse-drawn carriage from his house to Independence Hall, caused him such pain that he just couldn't do that. Now we think of Franklin as an inventive person, and he came up with a great idea. As a souvenir from his diplomatic time in Paris, he had in his collection of lifetime artifacts a sedan chair. And that turned out to be the most pain-free way for poor Franklin to be conveyed back and forth between his house and Independence Hall. There's one painting that captures this. It's a little bit impressionistic, and this is a picture of the painting, so it's not as clear as it might be, but you see Franklin with the sedan chair on the ground so he can say hi to his admirers on the way to Independence Hall. He actually was conveyed there by trusty prisoners from the Philadelphia City Jail who were assigned that duty. Now, this may seem like a boring topic, the procedures adopted, but they're really critical to an understanding of how these delegates managed to ever overcome their initial huge differences of opinion. Because both at the start of the convention and along the way, they consciously adopted some procedures which I think were absolutely critical to eventually reaching any kind of consensus. As you might imagine, there were a lot of lawyers in the total delegation from the various states, and to their credit, the first thing that they thought ought to be done when everybody got there was to draw up some rules to guide the deliberations. So on the very first weekend, a small group of them got together and drafted a set of proposed rules for the convention. And they were very simple, but they've been widely praised by historians for facilitating eventual compromise and consensus. The first technique that they adopted was called the Committee of the Whole, which involved the idea that when an item for debate would come up, it would be talked through, everybody got a chance to say something about it, and a vote would be taken at the end of the discussion. But it would not be deemed to be a binding vote. It was a so-called straw vote, a kind of figure out which way the wind was blowing among the totality of the delegates. And the good part about this in relation to our problem of positioning and people coming in heavily committed to a point of view that they would stubbornly cling to was that they didn't have to look back and consider themselves bound by how they felt the first time a subject was discussed. And they could go home at night, have dinner with delegates from another state, talk it through, take a fresh look at it, and we're totally free to vote a different way, again in a non-binding way, the next time it came up. It might come up the next day, it might not come up again for several weeks, the way this convention played out. And this idea of straw voting was very, very heavily utilized. On some items, such as the structure of the executive branch, as many as 60 straw votes were taken on a single proposal before they considered the issue to have been, sufficiently vetted in order to be able to take a final and a binding vote. And so a lot of people credit this kind of iterative process of reapproaching an issue after it's been sitting for a while and coming back and taking a fresh look as promoting the eventual ability of people to come off their initial positions and reach agreement. Now, the deliberations that they had didn't start in a vacuum. The people from Virginia did a lot of homework before they got to Philadelphia, and their governor was the first speaker, as I said earlier, and what he proposed was called then the Virginia Resolves, and it was a plan of government that was pretty comprehensive, but it was written from the standpoint of a large state. Virginia was one of the high population states, and they had very strong points of view on certain issues, as we're going to see, that favored the high population states. And so that provoked a response from New Jersey, which was considered at that time a small state. And so in mid-June, the New Jersey delegation came forth with a rival set of proposals, which were more compatible with the philosophy of the smaller states. They proposed a weaker form of central government than the large states seemed to favor. And of course, New Jersey and the small states were quite happy with the existing situation where every state had an equal number of votes in the legislature. And of course, the Virginia and large state plan wanted voting in the legislature to be based on population, not on equal status for all the states. The New Jersey plan is also very interesting for a novel idea that they proposed for the executive branch. And this again reveals this kind of fear or paranoia that the small states had about over-concentration of power. So they proposed not a single executive, the president, they proposed a multiple chief executive with at least 3 different people from 3 different parts of the country sharing executive power simultaneously. So you can see how far apart some of these points of view were. Before we get to how these clashes got eventually resolved, I want to just briefly refer to a couple of other procedural innovations that got devised by the delegates along the way as they were slogging through these very contentious and exhausting debates with the straw votes and so forth. All of that continued into late July. Bear in mind it started in early May. At that point, the delegates decided to appoint a committee of 5 persons. I love the names that they come up with. You're going to see another one in a minute. The Committee of Detail, they called this 5-person committee. And they were charged with organizing what at that point were probably 100, several dozen anyway, separate proposals that had been introduced, debated, straw votes taken, and so forth. But they weren't organized in any way. They were just several dozen separate proposals. So this committee was charged with organizing them into a single document and trying to boil them down a bit. So to allow that to happen, a 10-day recess was called in late July. George Washington was so happy to get a break from what he was despairing of that he went fishing. And he's actually got some interesting diary entries about his fishing trip. 10 days later, the delegates came back, and what they found that the Committee of Detail had worked so hard on was now down to 23 proposals to be retaken up and redebated once more. And that launched another month of debate starting in early August. Well, by September 8th, after further exhausting dialogues, they decided to appoint one more 5-person committee. This is the name I love, the Committee of Style and Arrangement. And that 5-person committee was asked to take these 23 separate resolutions, which had been produced by the Committee of Detail and then further debated for a month, and they were asked to simplify those resolutions, integrate them into a cohesive document with polished language, and in effect, to produce a document that could be subjected to a final up or down vote. And quite miraculously, this 5-person committee did their work in 5 days and reduced those previous 23 resolutions into what became 7 articles in the Constitution, as if you picked it up today and looked at it. Now, there was one more procedural thing which may be surprising. In the modern era, we put a lot of emphasis on transparency in governmental operations. The public has a right to know, and so forth. These delegates, and George Washington was very, very strong on this point, felt strongly that there should not be leaks to the public about these deliberations. Now, this is pretty counterintuitive to what we think of today as open government. But again, this ties into this business of becoming unbonded from the fixed positions that they started from. So at the end of a day's deliberations, there were no press conferences. The journalists were kept out of the deliberations. They were not allowed in. And there was this pledge of secrecy that the delegates adhered to and did not give interviews, did not talk about who said what. And again, that left people free to change their minds as time went on and not be stuck with an embarrassing accusation that, in July you felt so strongly this way, but in September you come out the other end, So that is a striking example of a pragmatic, self-imposed discipline that they took in the name of having a full and free debate that could eventually result in a consensus. So, time doesn't permit, obviously, going into all of the issues which were the subject of these raging debates, but we can certainly do a sampling of them. I said a little while ago that the challenges were both philosophical and physical. We talked about the physical. So to me, the most difficult philosophical issue they faced was this first one that I'm going to comment about, and I'll just read this: how to create a strong enough central or national government, which was lacking under the Articles of Confederation, and yet preserve some measure of individual sovereignty or feelings of independence for the states. This was really the core dilemma that kept people divided for as long as they were in that hot, humid room without ventilation. It was obvious to people like Alexander Hamilton and Madison and George Washington that there had to be a much stronger central, national, or what we've since come to call federal government. But many of the states and the delegates that they sent to this convention were clinging quite stubbornly to what they celebrated as their independence, their self-identity, their sovereignty. The contrary view, people came at it from different perspectives. Alexander Hamilton was an expert in finance and economics. So his take on the need for a strong central government was completely driven by his insight that we would never grow into a robust economic entity as a nation unless we had a stronger, much stronger central government. Madison was not an economist, he was a political scientist, and he had studied all the world's forms of government, and he came at the need for a stronger central government from that political scientist's point of view. And George Washington, who was equally committed to strengthening the central government, was just purely pragmatic. If we can't pay, we couldn't pay the debt that we incurred to feed and clothe my soldiers during the Revolutionary War, God help us. We've got to have a stronger and more stable and more predictable form of government than we have had in the past. Interestingly, though, the delegates, especially from the smaller states, felt otherwise. And they had some very good arguments. You know, they simply had to get up and say, remember how oppressive the British were to us, and they simply equated the idea of reposing stronger powers in a central government as, you know, reliving the possibility that their independence as states could be snuffed out. And they gave speeches on the floor of this convention to the effect that they did not want a central government to be empowered in such a way that they might abolish the individual status of the colonies that had become states. So, you know, we go back to this proposal about 3 presidents, co-sharing executive power. Where did that come from? Well, when a single chief executive was proposed, that sounded like the king all over again. And so they resisted that and came up with this idea of the shared co-presidency. So it's pretty easy now to see why what we learned in high school civics or government or whatever it was called in your school, that so many so-called checks and balances got folded into the final document. Little obstacles to over-concentration of power, because there was a fear that among the 3 branches of government, one might become too strong, and so you have these examples that we're all familiar with. So Congress can pass a law, that's the legislative branch, but the president can veto that law. If there's a strong enough consensus in the legislature, Congress can override the president's veto. So check, balance, check, balance. The Supreme Court, the president can only nominate a person to serve on the Supreme Court. That nomination is subject to the advice and consent of the Senate, just as are treaties. And so you have numerous examples of this kind of compromise, you know, in terms of the checks and balances. And so, you know, I guess I come back again to this one historian who called it the miracle of Philadelphia, that with all these differences, they were eventually able to come to an agreement. Now, the next item is slavery. The institution of slavery long pre-existed the date of this meeting, as we know. And, you know, a lot of people in the last year, when we've had so many racial tensions in this country, starting with the Ferguson and the problems between police and African Americans in various settings, I've heard people say, wouldn't it have been wonderful if the delegates to this convention could simply have wiped out, abolished the institution of slavery? That was really a political impossibility. Once the delegates from the southern states voted to send delegates there, the importance, the economic importance of the institution of slavery to the agricultural South was just too big a deal to admit of compromise. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't debates about slavery at the convention. There were many abolitionist points of view expressed, but in the end, it was a political necessity, as perceived by those who were there, that slavery be allowed to continue. The hardcore abolitionists fervently believed that slavery would simply die out as an institution. Though they advocated abolition, they did eventually, in effect, contradict what they had said 11 years earlier in the Declaration of Independence, which said quite eloquently, all men are created equal. And then they turned around and agreed to a document which wrote inequality right into the blueprint for the new national government. So the so-called 3/5 compromise was, you'll remember, the way of how you would tabulate population for the purposes of determining how many representatives a state would be able to send to the new House of Representatives. So a free person was counted as 1, and a slave was counted as 3/5 of a free person. So slavery was, in those terms, directly recognized and validated in the Constitution. The other item was the continuation of the slave trade, the economic engine of the buying and selling of human beings. By the time of this convention, England had already criminalized the slave trade, and they empowered their navy to enforce the criminal laws against the slave trade. There were debates about ending the slave trade. The abolitionists from the North thought it was entirely likely that once the slave trade was made illegal, that the institution of slavery would more quickly die out. But there again, a compromise was made, and Congress, the new Congress, was prohibited from passing any legislation to affect the legality of the slave trade for another 20 years. And it's written right into the Constitution that they couldn't begin to broach that topic until the year 1808. So, sad but true. Here is a controversy. It's not nearly as big a one as the other ones we've talked about, but it had to do with, and again, a reflection of this jealousy and rivalry among the states. If we're going to have a new government, we ought to have a new capital, a new seat of government. But the small states said, again in their paranoia, if we allow the new seat of government to be located within the four corners of a single state, that state may end up getting overly favored by the new national government. They were so worried about this kind of rivalry and favoritism. So the new Congress in the Constitution was authorized to create, in effect, a new national capital on neutral ground, 10 miles square. And that phrase, 10 miles square, is in the Constitution. And the eventual compromise there was that both Virginia and Maryland ceded some of their land to what became the District of Columbia. The last of these contentious items that we're going to talk about had to do with the big central and inflammatory topic of how representation in the new Congress would be determined. And this was, again, a renewal of the debate about the large states and the small states. And of course, the small states wanted it to be equal the way it was under the Articles of Confederation, and the large states wanted it to be based on population. And it seems obvious in retrospect that the compromise, the so-called Great Compromise, which was finally reached, should have been obvious from the start, but it wasn't. And this debate really raged a very, very long time, from the beginning of the deliberations in May. One of the two people that I call the unsung heroes of this convention is the one who suggested this so-called Great Compromise, which of course was that we have one house based on population, the House of Representatives, and one house based on equal representation, the Senate. So here's the man who made that suggestion. I say unsung heroes because these two people I'm going to mention, you've never heard of them, probably. I mean, you're way ahead of me if you knew about him. Roger Sherman from Connecticut was the one who first suggested two houses, one based on population and one based on equal representation. He brought that subject up and it got voted down. And he brought it back up again a month later, thanks to the straw vote committee of the whole technique, and that time it got adopted. Sherman was the second oldest person at the convention. He was 66 to Franklin's 81. He had been the mayor of New Haven, Connecticut, where Yale is located, and he had been a delegate to the Continental Congress. After the Constitution was ratified and the new government was set up, he first served in the new House of Representatives, and eventually he served in the new Senate as well. The second unsung hero is James Wilson of Pennsylvania. He's another person who, the more I read about this convention, I came to admire him, even though I didn't really know anything about him before. He was one of the few people among the delegates to the convention who was not a native of this country. He was born in Scotland. And initially, he achieved a great academic reputation in Scotland as a learned scholar and teacher in the fields of philosophy and law and government. But then he switched more to the practical side. He came to this country, settled in Pennsylvania. He practiced law there. And from the reading that I've done, it seems to be pretty universally agreed that he was the intellectual giant in the room throughout these deliberations. He participated very actively in all the debates. He was one of the 5 members of the Committee of Detail, which boiled the 100 down to 23. And he was described, one contemporary described his mind as, quote, a blaze of light. Another historian said, when Wilson rises to speak, it is as if an electric charge passes down the page of the records of the convention, the hard, relentless light of intellect. So he made a very, very powerful and persuasive impression on his colleagues, and he also made an equally strong impression on George Washington, who presided over it all. He was so impressed by Wilson's performance that Wilson was among the first people that Washington appointed to the new U.S. Supreme Court, which got configured in 1790. Well, there's no mystery about how this story ends. They did reach an agreement. That 7 articles that the Committee of Style and Arrangement came up with got subjected to an up or down vote on September 17th of 1787. It was adopted by representatives from all 12 of the states who were present, Rhode Island staying away till the very end, and past the very end. What they voted to do in the resolution of adoption was to send the document to the Continental Congress so that the Congress could commence a ratification process. And that's what happened. And over the next 2 years, culminating in votes that concluded in 1789, the Constitution was ratified by all 13 states, including Rhode Island, even though they didn't participate in the drafting. So I want to allow time for your questions or comments about this. I just would like to say, kind of in a conclusory way, that you can't read this story. You can't encounter it without being totally impressed by the amount of effort and compromise and flexibility that eventually got launched, even though they came together with such very, very disparate and fixed and opposing points of view. It really is miraculous. We have to be grateful that they gave up their habits of positioning in favor of the consensus that they did reach. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to entertain your thoughts, questions, concerns. Yes, sir.
Well, let me try a couple. By the way, that was lovely
Oh.
and a great way to spend a Saturday. So, in keeping with your bold attempt to apply a search for mindfulness to the Constitution, I would think in some way we could focus a little more on Washington, because he has this gift of leading without ruling. That is, he takes seriously the idea that he's there to preside. He gives very few comments.
Yeah.
They're only procedural when he talks. And he recognizes himself, there's other bright people in the room, and that if he plays the role of fair referee, it's more likely to work out well than if he tries to say, gee, I'm chair, so let me tell you what to do. The second thought I want to give for you is, probably the greatest example of mindfulness, I would say, in the Constitutional Liberation is Madison, who, your thesis aside, is universally regarded as the central architect, the most intellectual figure, the person who came prepared, who goes to Princeton, who studies for months to be ready for the Constitution, who has the only viable plan. So they have to talk about his plan. And he is committed to the idea that there's no room for a Bill of Rights. And then he flips. And he flips in the ratification process, in part because Jefferson, his good friend, wants him to, in part because Patrick Henry really wants him to, and he can only defeat Patrick Henry, the much better speaker, at the Virginia ratification by switching sides. And so he moves from being sort of associated with what would be the Federalist camp to becoming what will be eventually what they would call the Republican camp, that we need something different.
States' rights.
And so that flexibility of, he really wants the whole, it's hard to name a politician in America today who is more a Republican than an American, or more a Democrat than an American. And yet Madison changes parties and changes sides because he can see that that's the better argument. And I think that's probably the best example of mindfulness. I'll share just a couple more things. One is, I think they really have the sense that we don't, that this is an important moment, and that they know at the moment they're writing this Constitution, Russia's ruled by the Romanovs, has been for hundreds of years. France is ruled by their imperial house. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is perfectly intact. That the old world reigns, and they are the hope of a new world, that change is possible. And that, to me, would be another example of mindfulness. I assume you'll give this talk again, so I'm giving you some thoughts on it. Slavery. It is universally regarded. Slavery was only economically profitable because of human husbandry. That is, all the plantations were going broke, and Jefferson's goes broke, Madison's goes broke, Washington's goes broke. You can only make slavery economically viable because you sell off the human livestock. If the North had wanted, they probably could have paid off the South. But the South's whole, it's not that slavery was productive, and that's why no one practices it. It really isn't productive, unless you can sell the slaves. It's not a viable way to run a corporation. No one would think Apple would be better off if they could suddenly have slaves. It required, the South had so much money invested in slavery that the North could just never reach the amount the South would want to be bought off. And what a pity that happened. Okay, those are my thoughts for whatever value.
Thank you very much, and I don't disagree with most of your observations. You did bring up the Bill of Rights, and that's an interesting thing for me to just say a brief word about. Bill of Rights did not get attached to the Constitution during this convention. it was debated whether or not a Bill of Rights was necessary or appropriate. And the seeds of the Bill of Rights were sown, as the gentleman suggests, during these deliberations. The interesting thing is, you know, just take the Bill of Rights as the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. The First Amendment is the one that we're all most familiar with, which embodies freedom of speech and assembly, press, and freedom of religion, all these very, very basic things. And the small states, the people who feared the potential oppression that might be brought to bear on them by the new powerful central government, lobbied hard for a Bill of Rights because they wanted the new central government to be restrained from interfering with such precious things as free speech and freedom of religion, and not to be have a state religion imposed on them, the so-called establishment of religion. And the point of view that carried the day to the contrary was, well, in the document that we're about to adopt, we didn't give Congress the power to affect speech or to affect religion or to affect the press or anything else. So it is not necessary to give you that assurance and to write it into the Constitution. You know, that turned out ultimately not to be a very persuasive point of view to the people who feared the concentration of power in the central government. And so by the time people left Philadelphia, it was pretty well understood that coming along behind the ratification of the Constitution would be a carefully drafted Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, and they got ratified by 1791 and became then attached to the basic document that was drafted in Philadelphia. And thank you for bringing up the bill, because that is an important aspect. Any other observations? Yes, Jim?
It seems staggering that 2 5-person committees, 10 people, could be so instrumental, because at some point a center needed to be found of what they really were doing there, and that it seemed to me maybe that is where that center was found, was with the 10 people realizing that there really was something that had to be done, and compromise had to be done, and those 10 people were in that process. And it's just staggering to think about that.
One of the 5 people on the Committee of Style and Arrangement, the last committee, which produced the 7 articles out of the 23 prior proposals, one of the 5 was Alexander Hamilton. Interestingly, though, if you read about the convention itself, Hamilton didn't spend much time there. He made a speech that was pretty widely criticized. He left and went back to New York. He wasn't the mover and shaker that, you know, we now look back and credit him and Madison with the advocacy of ratification that was done through the so-called Federalist Papers. But he wasn't, until the end, really a very powerful presence there in terms of influencing the final outcome. But he was among the 5 on the Committee of Style and Arrangement. And we've lived long enough to see a Broadway musical about Alexander Hamilton. Go figure. Yes, sir, in the back.
Thank you. I want to echo the thanks, I think, of everyone for a really brilliant, fascinating talk. I hope you'll do it for television. Really, seriously. You know, right now we're in a situation where we have a weak central global government. And it seems to me we desperately need a strong central global government with freedom and sovereignty allowed to the states. So, what are your reflections on, I mean, I am aware of Article 109 in the UN Charter that allows for a review, which would constitute a global constitutional convention if it were taken seriously. And I think there's a great deal of discouragement that it's a non-starter because of the veto. And that they'll, none of the 5 veto holders will ever. But there's another point of view, which is, hey, because you guys, you 5 guys, which it does amount to, by the way, the leaders of the 5 nations, you've got the security of knowing that you can put the kibosh on any plan until it's finally, so therefore you have the responsibility to be leaders here and get us out of this predicament.
Well, my reflection there is pretty brief. In my idealistic self, I would agree that it would be very, very beneficial if there were some, framework under which what you suggest could be achieved. But in my pragmatic self, I just don't see it happening. And there's just too much self-interest, too much, celebration of sovereignty and independence against the background of the international stage, that, ad hoc arrangements from time to time to deal with specific problems can come about under a lot of pressure, but some universal type of framework, I just despair, as Washington did.
Despite that, you can observe what's happening in Europe, for example, where Europe is trying to integrate itself into a union, and how that is difficult and going the wrong way. Even.
Yeah.
And therefore, thinking about anything bigger than that, this is, as you said, way premature.
But I must point out that Washington was wrong, as you
Yeah.
pointed out.
Well, on that note, we can say that's why we're here at Dartmouth College, because we're trying not to despair.